goal of making our economy stable and getting our country back to the path of long-term prosperity. As we've shown again today, with our decision not to put fuel duty up this year, we are supporting hard-up families, keeping our economy safe. That is my number one priority, and it is what I spend the overwhelming majority of my time working on. It doesn't mean it has to be the only thing that I consider to be important. And neither is it the limit of this government's ambitions, and nor should it be. And let's not forget, what surprised many about the coalition agreement was the fact that it didn't settle for the lowest common denominator when it came to setting out our plans in this Parliament, as many predicted a coalition would be forced to do. Instead, we set out an ambitious and sometimes controversial programme of reform. For example, by making work pay for everyone, by raising the personal income tax threshold to £10,000 and radically reforming the benefit system. Giving everyone a fair start in life, increasing early years support, reforming the education system, introducing a pupil premium, measures to promote social mobility, and indeed committing to be the greenest government ever too. And remember, we inherited not just an economic crisis, but a crisis in the trust of our political system too. Which is why the coalition agreement also set out the government's plans to clean up politics. It says, and it's worth reminding ourselves, we believe that our political system is broken. We urgently need fundamental political reform. And so we have set to work. Reforming party funding, introducing fixed-term parliaments to stop the dates of elections being fixed to suit the government, increasing accountability in public services through, among other things, direct elections for mayors and police commissioners. And it is why we are taking forward reform of the House of Lords too. Across every policy area, both parties in this coalition continue to have a responsibility to deliver the reforms we set out, right to the end of this Parliament. Because even for those who don't like to admit it, both partners in this coalition will be judged not on the ambition of our rhetoric, but on how effectively we continue to work together to implement the policies in the coalition agreement. All of them. Those who suggest that the whole of government can focus on delivering only one thing at a time forget what reforms are already in progress across our public services, at precisely the same time as maintaining our relentless efforts to ensure our economy is on the right track. So right across the political spectrum, we all have a responsibility to deliver reform of the House of Lords, because it is what we promised. Liberal Democrats, Conservatives, a coalition government, as reaffirmed at Cabinet today, with one voice, totally united behind reform, and yes, the Labour Party too. We all collectively should feel the pressure to deliver, because it is what all three parties committed to in our election manifestos. And so we should see that commitment through. Not because it's the number one thing that comes up on the doorstep, because it is the right thing to do. Because in a democracy, lawmakers should be elected. The case for reform is indisputable, and the time for action long overdue. It was over 100 years ago that the Liberal government's call to curtail the power of the unelected peers was supported by the people. Mr. Asquith said, in the first reading debate of the 1911 Parliament Act, it's worth revisiting the Hansard one actually, we hold that there ought to be a second chamber, and that it is a body which, unlike the House of Lords, rests not on a hereditary, but on a popular basis. Churchill, who was then Liberal Home Secretary, wound up the debate. But despite these lofty aspirations, various attempts at reform have failed. The Bryce Report of 1918 was not implemented. Cross-party talks in 1948 broke down. The Labour government of 1966 to 70 failed to implement their manifesto pledges. The Royal Commission of 1999-2000 recommended options for electing peers that were not taken forward. And white papers in 2001, 2007 and 2008 failed to deliver a single elected peer. The House of Lords hasn't even been reformed to be fit for the 20th century, let alone the 21st. Now, of course, the moves towards life peerages and abolition of most hereditary peers helped to make some progress, and importantly made it possible for increased numbers of women to be members of the second chamber. Today, just over 20% of peers are female, as opposed to less than 10% in 1988. Is it really plausible to argue that such limited progress is sufficient? Particularly when these reforms fail to address the major point that lawmakers should be elected. As a country, we have a proud tradition of peaceful and gradual democratic reform that goes back centuries. But our failure to make progress on laws reform means we've fallen behind. We have the dubious honour of having a second chamber of the same ilk as Jordan, the country, Belize, Burkina Faso. It's not something to be proud of. A second chamber stuffed with former politicians, cronies, lobbyists, that is a living embodiment to the barriers to social mobility in this country. A second chamber that is growing in size and in cost too. And the closer you look, I have to say, as a Liberal Democrat, the more embarrassing it gets. Those who say an appointed second chamber rises above grubby partisan politics seem to ignore the inconvenient facts. Many peers fall into a category of people that Boris Johnson yesterday described as has-beens and never-wases. More than a quarter of peers are ex-MPs. 70% are appointed on a party political basis, which unsurprisingly means that they are almost as likely to vote according to their party whip, as often as their colleagues in the Commons. Another argument used against reform is the importance of appointed lords being able to provide an expert perspective to the legislative process. The only problem is many of the experts are actually ex-experts. They might have been experts in their field once in their day, but for many it's been decades since they retired and the knowledge of their profession has become, in some cases, very out of date. Whilst it is possible to ensure that perspectives from all parts of the country have the opportunity to be represented in the Commons, the same cannot be said of our second chamber. Members from London and the South East dominate. Around 50% of peers originate from these regions. And they are not socially representative either. 4 times as many are over 90 as under 40. More than 60% were privately educated. 40% of the total attended just 12 private schools. It's an outdated system, and it doesn't come cheap either. Every single peer is entitled to £300 a day, tax-free, just for turning up. A right they retain, regardless of attendance or performance, for the rest of their lives. And it's getting more expensive with every year that goes by. Without reform, the number of peers will hit 1,000 within 10 years at the current rate of growth, making the House of Lords the biggest legislative body outside the Congress of the People's Republic of China. Of course, I freely admit the House of Commons is hardly perfect. I'm sure you'll be talking about that today too. The expenses scandal exposed the failings of individuals and a system that led too many people to behave as they liked, thinking they had a job for life. Exactly, of course, what is offered to life peers. The crisis that forced long overdue change to the House of Commons and has resulted in greater transparency, accountability and reduced costs. Reforms undertaken by the House itself, and reforms that will be supported too by the government's plans to reduce the number of MPs by 50. So just as we support a House of Commons that modernises and is accountable to the people it serves, the House of Lords cannot be exempt from change if we are serious about delivering our pledge to rebuild the bond between our politicians and the people they serve. But our plans don't mean that we start with a blank sheet of paper. We recognise the House of Lords has many qualities that are worth preserving. The capacity to take the long view, a focus on making sure our legislation is of the highest standard, the ability to put an alternative perspective. Preserving these important qualities is not threatened by reform. It is dependent on it. A reformed House of Lords, I believe, will command public confidence by giving the people the power to decide who acts in their name, by being more representative of the country at large, by ensuring that all members of it treat it as an important and responsible job and not membership of an elite and exclusive club. There is much that needs to be put right, and Liberal Democrats have perhaps the longest held and clearest views on exactly how we should proceed. Views that we have promoted in this government and that were evident in last year's white paper and draft bill. That the House of Lords should be mainly directly elected. It should be significantly smaller. That the first election should be held in May 2015, and that the primacy of the House of Commons must be maintained. Now, of course, Parliament will be the first to learn of the details of the government's plans. But broadly speaking, our main proposals will be consistent with the white paper and draft bill. They reflect the valuable input from the Joint Committee and its report, which heavily informed and influenced our proposals. And they remain driven by the fundamental principle of democratic representation. However, especially during these times of austerity, it is also important that reform has a price we can all afford. We shouldn't be increasing the overall costs of Parliament when ordinary people are struggling to make ends meet. So at the very most, the increase in the day-to-day costs of a reformed democratic House should be no more than the savings we make from reducing the number of MPs. Moreover, they should be sustainable and provide value for money for the taxpayer. Now, this parsimony is in stark contrast to the wildly inflated figures being thrown about by opponents of reform. Now, I'm sure the public will be reassured that we have no plans to spend £100 million holding an unnecessary referendum, or a further £100 million on staff for existing peers. The package we draw up is frugal but fair. However, we're not happy just to stop there. I will be pushing to find further ways to reduce the burden on the taxpayer still further. And we may be clamping down on costs, but we're not holding back on ambition. I am confident these are reforms we will deliver, because this government has learned the lessons why previous attempts at reform have failed. Big reform agendas can only be delivered through a broad consensus. So we will not allow the best to be the enemy of the good, and we have made compromises where it will make the difference between taking a big step forward or going nowhere at all. As a whole, this is a package that the government is totally united in its strong commitment to deliver. It's a package that will not be dependent on a referendum to proceed, because there is a distinction between proposals designed to help achieve consensus and proposals designed to deliver nothing except terminal delay to reform. This government is committed to completing the reform process within this Parliament. And whilst Labour may be tempted to support referendum calls because they think it is to their short-term tactical advantage, I think they do so at their peril. Do they really want to delay the reform that they themselves promised in their general election manifesto? Have they taken into account the consequences of having referenda on Lords and Scottish independence at the same time? Do they wish to distract from a campaign as important as preserving the United Kingdom? Can it convincingly be explained why their government abolished hereditary peerages without a referendum in 1999 and that it is essential now? And if what I've heard today is correct, I think it is also a disgrace that Labour MPs will be voting against the programme motion of the bill, an attempt at sabotage of reforms that they claim to support. And while Lords reform is not a subject that comes up every day on the doorstep, when asked, there is a clear majority in favour of improvement on the status quo. Research undertaken by YouGov found that a majority of people were in support of some reform to the House of Lords. Presumably that is why every political party included such proposals in their general election manifestos. Their research found that 69% favoured a reformed House of Lords with at least some members elected, only 5% supported the status quo. But this should not be used as a justification for complacency. It is a good basis of support from which to make the public case, and a good platform from which to launch our wider constitutional reform agenda. Because we must go further if we are serious in our commitment to clean up politics and restore public confidence. Boundary reform in the Commons and reform in the House of Lords represent very good progress. But we will not stop there. We remain committed to cleaning up party funding. And the work to go further on devolution and deliver greater localism is a continuous process. These are reforms that we will continue to press for and seek to achieve through consensus, just as we are doing on House of Lords reform. Now, Jim Hacker once told Sir Humphrey Appleby, in a discussion of the honours system, that a system that was started in 1348 was coming to the end of its trial period. After 100 years of debates, cross-party talks, green papers, white papers, command papers and a royal commission, it's time to complete the transitional reforms that started over 100 years ago. Tomorrow the coalition government will finally introduce a bill to reform the House of Lords. Now, I'm sure it will not signal the end of the debate on this subject, or even if it will signal the end of the beginning of the debate. But I am determined to honour the plans set out in the manifesto I wrote and the coalition agreement I negotiated on behalf of the Liberal Democrats. And this government is totally united in its commitment to deliver. After a century of delay, it is time to fulfil the promises of Asquith, of Lloyd George, and yes, Winston Churchill too, finally to give the people a voice in their Lordship's house. Thank you for listening.